strong and mighty, but, that one tired me out a bit.
You got your work boots on.
I got the same ones you got on.
Oh, there you go.
The night the applause stopped, Jolene Macintyre stood alone beneath a ceiling of broken light, her breath shallow, her name echoing like a ghost that no longer belonged to her. What the world would later call a turning point was, in truth, a quiet unraveling, a moment when everything she had built collapsed inward, leaving only memory and regret. Fame had once wrapped itself around her like armor, but now it lay scattered, useless against the weight of grief she carried in silence. Somewhere, beyond the cameras and headlines, a woman who had given her voice to millions wondered if she had ever truly been heard herself. How does someone survive becoming a symbol when they are still bleeding underneath? And when the story everyone knows ends in tragedy, what remains untold in the shadows afterward? This is not the story of success as it is remembered. This is the story of the cost, paid slowly, painfully, by a soul who kept walking even when the world stopped watching. The room was still humming when the lights dimmed, not with music, but with the lingering electricity of what had just ended. Jolene Macintyre stood alone at the edge of the stage, the applause already gone, the echo of it still vibrating in the walls like a memory that refused to settle. Overhead, a single spotlight flickered, uncertain whether it should remain or disappear, casting her shadow long and distorted across the floor. In that moment, the world that had once felt so loud fell into an unnatural quiet. Her breathing was shallow, measured, as though she were afraid that too much air might shatter what little composure remained. Faces had vanished into darkness, but their expectations lingered, heavy and unspoken. This was supposed to be another night of triumph, another chapter in a story the public thought it understood. Instead, it became the instant everything split open. Inside her chest, panic and grief folded into one another, indistinguishable, impossible to name. The narrator drifts through her thoughts, where memory collides with dread. Jolene replays the hours leading here, the small decisions she dismissed, the warnings she ignored, the exhaustion she normalized. Fame had trained her to endure, to smile through fractures, to believe that collapse only happened to other people. Now, standing beneath broken light, she feels exposed in a way cameras had never captured. This was not failure as spectacle. This was failure as solitude. Outside, the night waits indifferent. Inside, Jolene feels time slow, each second stretching under the weight of realization. The armor she built from praise and achievement lies useless, stripped away by a single moment she cannot undo. Messages flood her phone, unanswered, unread, their concern blurred with curiosity, support tangled with judgment. She cannot tell which is which anymore. The space around her becomes symbolic, a cathedral of what once was. The empty seats feel accusatory, reminders of promises made and broken, of a self she no longer knows how to perform. She wonders quietly whether the world ever saw her, or only the idea of her. The thought settles like a bruise. Being known, she realizes, is not the same as being understood. As she steps away from the stage, the camera lingers not on her face, but on her hands, trembling despite her effort to steady them. This is the first time she allows herself to imagine a future where the applause does not return. Fear creeps in, not of obscurity, but of silence, of confronting the woman who exists without an audience to define her. The chapter closes with Jolene pausing at the exit, her reflection fractured in the glass door ahead. She knows that once she crosses this threshold, nothing will be the same. One decision waits for her in the darkness beyond, irreversible and defining, and she stands frozen, unsure whether stepping forward means survival or surrender. Long before the lights and the waiting crowds, before her name learned how to travel faster than her voice, Jolene Macintyre learned the shape of silence. It lived in the corners of her childhood home, in rooms where words were rationed and emotions were handled like fragile objects no one wanted to break. The air was often thick with things left unsaid, a quiet that pressed against her ears until she learned to stop asking questions. The house itself seemed to listen more than it spoke. Floors creaked with memory, walls absorbed arguments and released none of them back. Jolene moved through these spaces carefully, instinctively shrinking, learning when to disappear and when to perform usefulness. Love arrived inconsistently, conditional and fleeting, leaving her to wonder which version of herself deserved it most. The narrator peers gently into her young mind, where longing and self-doubt formed early, inseparable twins. She found refuge where she could, in melodies hummed under her breath, in imaginary stages conjured in the quiet of her room. Music became a place where silence obeyed her, where absence could be filled with sound she controlled. But even then, the seeds of endurance were planted too deep. Every small success taught her a dangerous lesson, that attention had to be earned, that stillness meant invisibility, that being ordinary was a risk she could not afford. School offered brief escape, but familiar patterns followed. Teachers praised her discipline, her talent, her ability to stand out without causing trouble. No one noticed how tightly she held herself together, how praise felt less like joy and more like permission to exist. At home, she learned to read moods the way other children learn stories, adjusting her presence to avoid becoming a burden. Emotional survival became an unspoken skill, sharpened quietly over time. The narrator lingers on moments that seemed insignificant then, but glowed with consequence later. The first time applause replaced affection. The first time silence felt safer than honesty. Jolene did not yet have the language to name loneliness, but she felt its gravity, pulling her inward even as her dreams stretched outward. As adolescence approached, her ambition hardened into necessity. Becoming someone remarkable no longer felt like desire. It felt like survival. She began to understand dimly that the world rewarded performance more than vulnerability. And so she practiced becoming what others wanted, polishing herself until the cracks disappeared from view. The chapter ends with Jolene standing alone in her childhood room, listening to the familiar quiet settle around her. In that stillness, a realization takes hold. To be safe, to be seen, she may need to become someone else entirely, and leave parts of herself behind forever. Success arrived without ceremony, then all at once. Jolene Macintyre's name began to move through rooms before she entered them, whispered with admiration, expectation, possession. Stages grew larger, lights brighter, applause louder, yet something inside her grew increasingly distant, as though the sound could no longer reach where she lived. The narrator frames her rise as a series of beautifully lit rooms that never quite felt warm enough to stay in. She learned quickly how to stand still under scrutiny, how to accept praise with practiced grace while guarding the quieter truth beneath it. Each performance demanded more precision, more emotional restraint. She gave everything the audience asked for, sometimes more, until exhaustion became her baseline and rest felt undeserved. Fame rewarded her discipline while quietly punishing her humanity. Behind the scenes, solitude followed her like a shadow. Hotel rooms blurred together, their silence louder than any crowd. Conversations became strategic, filtered, transactional. Trust thinned under the pressure of expectation. Jolene smiled for photographs, nodded through interviews, answered questions about joy, while privately negotiating anxiety that refused to name itself. The narrator explores the fracture widening between who she appeared to be and who she feared she was becoming. Moments of triumph arrived regularly, but fulfillment did not. Applause washed over her and receded, leaving behind the same ache. She wondered, in fleeting moments she quickly dismissed, whether the version of herself the world adored had replaced the one she once knew. Yet stopping felt impossible. To slow down would mean confronting the silence she had outrun since childhood. Relationships strained under the weight of her absence, even when she was present. People praised her resilience, mistaking endurance for strength. Jolene internalized the belief that struggle was private, that vulnerability would dismantle the image she had worked so hard to build. The cost of being extraordinary revealed itself slowly. In sleepless nights and emotional numbness, she learned to hide well. The narrator lingers on the irony of it all. She had achieved everything she once dreamed of, yet peace remained unreachable. The more visible she became, the less certain she felt of her own substance. Fame, once imagined as refuge, now felt like a narrowing corridor with no visible exit. The chapter closes on Jolene standing backstage, listening to a crowd chant her name with devotion she cannot return. As she steps toward the light, she senses with quiet dread that the life she chased is no longer carrying her forward, but pulling her under instead. At the height of her visibility, Jolene Macintyre felt most unseen. The world demanded consistency, gratitude, brilliance, never pause. Each appearance became an act of maintenance, preserving a version of herself the public refused to let evolve. The narrator situates her at this peak not as triumph, but as tension stretched to its limit. Psychological pressure closed in from all sides. Every word risked misinterpretation, every silence magnified. Jolene began to feel like a living monument, frozen in expectation. Privately, guilt festered, guilt for wanting rest, for feeling overwhelmed by what others called a gift. She feared disappointing an audience that had woven her into their lives, even as she felt herself unravel. A personal reckoning arrives quietly, devastating in its intimacy. Loss, unavoidable and deeply personal, cuts through the noise of her public life. Grief does not announce itself with spectacle. It settles slowly, contaminating everything it touches. Jolene tries to keep moving, to honor commitments, but the fracture deepens. The narrator explores how grief collides with obligation, leaving no space to heal. Isolation becomes deliberate. Jolene withdraws not out of arrogance, but survival. She stops reaching out, convinced that her darkness would burden those around her. The silence she once mastered now turns hostile, filling her thoughts with doubt and self-blame. Nights stretch endlessly, haunted by questions she cannot answer. The public notices changes, fatigue, distance, but interprets them through rumor rather than empathy. Jolene feels misread, reduced to speculation. The myth of her resilience becomes a prison, denying her the right to falter. She begins to question whether she is allowed to exist beyond her image at all. The narrator slows time as Jolene reaches a breaking point, a moment where continuing feels more frightening than stopping. The weight of being remembered presses heavily on her chest, and for the first time, she considers the cost of disappearing altogether. The chapter ends with Jolene alone in the dark, the world still asking for more, while she wonders, terrified and exhausted, if she can survive another day of being who everyone needs her to be. Obscurity arrives not as failure, but as quiet. Removed from the constant gaze, Jolene Macintyre steps into a slower world, where time is no longer measured by appearances or approval. The narrator frames this period not as escape, but confrontation. Without an audience, Jolene faces herself fully for the first time. Healing does not unfold cleanly. Days pass unevenly, marked by reflection and resistance. She revisits memories she once avoided, acknowledging grief she never allowed space to settle. The silence here is different, less demanding, more honest. It invites discomfort, but also possibility. Jolene begins redefining purpose beyond legacy. Small moments carry unexpected weight. Conversations without agendas, creativity without deadlines, rest without guilt. The narrator emphasizes rebirth not as triumph, but as acceptance. She learns that worth does not require witness, that meaning can exist quietly. The world slowly reframes her story, but Jolene loosens her grip on narrative control. She understands now that being remembered is not the same as being known. What matters most unfolds privately, in choices made without applause. The chapter closes with reflection. Jolene stands at a threshold once more, not of fame, but of self-recognition. The question lingers unresolved. Is redemption granted by the world or claimed inwardly? The answer remains open, echoing softly as the story fades to black.